There was no romantic howl at the moon, just a wet, pathetic scratching at the splintered wood of the cabin door, accompanied by the smell of copper and wet ash. When she opened it, there wasn't a noble beast waiting. It was a shivering, mud-caked child with yellow eyes and 2 sharp teeth, clutching a torn piece of a royal banner. The Alpha King's border guards had brought her another one. And just like the others, she couldn't turn him away. The axe bit into the pine block with a dull, heavy thud. Rowena wrenched the blade free, the wood splintering neatly in 2. She kicked the halves onto the growing pile near the porch and wiped a streak of grime from her forehead with the back of a heavily calloused hand. The wind was picking up, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow over the jagged peaks of the northern ridge. It was late autumn, but up here in the crags, winter didn't wait for the calendar. She lived on the fringe, geographically, politically, socially. The village of Oakhaven lay 3 miles down the mountain, close enough for her to trade her salves and tinctures for flour and salt, far enough that they didn't have to look at the outcast healer every day. They called her a witch when they were feeling brave. They called her Mom when they had a fever they couldn't sweat out. Rowena didn't care either way. Isolation was a cheap price to pay for peace. That peace fractured on a Tuesday. The crunch of heavy boots on the frost-hardened dirt broke the evening silence. Rowena didn't run for the door. She reached for the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. A sharp rap on the wood. Then a voice gruff and uncomfortable. "Healer, open up." Rowena pulled the door open a few inches. Standing on her porch was a man built like a falling boulder. He wore the thick leather and boiled wool of the Alpha King's border patrol, a heavy fur mantle draped over his broad shoulders. He smelled of wet dog pine needles and stale sweat. But it wasn't the guard that caught her attention. It was the bundle he held by the scruff of the neck. It looked like a wolf pup mostly. Coarse grey fur, oversized paws, a snout, tucked defensively into its chest. But the limbs were too long, the joints bending in ways a true wolf's wouldn't. A half-shifted child, stuck between forms, terrified. "Found this one scavenging near the southern boundary," the guard said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the woodpile. Southern Pack was eradicated last week. King Kaelin's orders. Treason, they say. But... The large man shifted his weight, the leather of his armor creaking. "We don't kill the young. So you bring them to me." Rowena's voice was flat. She didn't feign surprise. The Southern Rebellion was whispered about in the village market, a bloody affair meant to consolidate the Alpha King's chaotic territory. "The King's Keep is no place for feral whelps." The guard muttered. "They'd be torn apart by the older wolves or left to freeze in the kennels. You have a way with animals." "He is a child, not an animal. Right now he's both. And if you don't take him, I'm supposed to leave him in the woods to let nature sort it out. I figured... You being you..." He trailed off, finally meeting her eyes. There was a desperate kind of plea in his rough, scarred face. Rowena looked at the shivering bundle. The pup let out a high, reedy whine, a sound of pure, unadulterated misery. Blood matted the fur around its left hind leg. She sighed a long exhalation of breath that fogged in the freezing air. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Bring him in, and wipe your boots. I just scrubbed the floor." The guard stepped inside, depositing the pup onto the braided rug near the hearth. He didn't linger. He tossed a small leather pouch onto her table, a few silver coins, gilt money, and walked out into the encroaching dark. Rowena bolted the door. She turned to the rug. The pup had curled into a tight ball, trembling so violently his teeth chattered. "All right," Rowena murmured. She didn't coo. She didn't use baby talk. She spoke in the steady, rhythmic tone she used for frightened horses. She walked to the wash basin, soaking a clean linen cloth in warm water. "Let's see the damage." When she reached for him, the pup snapped. Jaws clamped down on her wrist. The teeth were razor-sharp, breaking the skin instantly. Blood welled up, warm and bright. Rowena didn't flinch. She didn't pull away that would only tear the flesh. She held perfectly still, looking down into panicked amber eyes. "I have food," she said quietly, "and a fire. If you bite me, I cannot cook the food or tend the fire. The choice is yours." The pup stared at her. Slowly the jaw unclenched. He shrank back, pressing himself against the stone of the hearth. Rowena took a deep breath, wrapped a spare cloth around her bleeding wrist, and went to the larder. She pulled out a chunk of venison, slicing it thin. She placed it on a wooden plate and slid it across the floor. The pup didn't move for a long minute. Then a small, dirty hand reached out from the fur. The transformation was agonizing to watch. Bones cracked and popped as they realigned. Fur receded into bruised, pale skin. Within moments there was no wolf on the rug. Just a boy, perhaps 6 years old, naked, filthy, and bruised, clutching his leg. He grabbed the meat with both hands, tearing into it raw. Rowena grabbed a woolen blanket from her bed and tossed it over his shoulders. "Eat," she said. "Then we wash. Then we set that leg." She sat by the fire, watching the orphan of a dead rebellion devour his meal. She had a feeling the silver coins on her table weren't going to last long. By the first heavy snow of December, the cabin smelled permanently of wet wool, wood smoke, and antiseptic herbs. And children. The first boy who eventually muttered that his name was Bran had been only the beginning. 2 weeks after Bran's arrival, a different guard appeared in the dead of night. He left a sullen, feral 12-year-old girl named Clara. Clara didn't speak. She just sat in the corners of the cabin, eyes tracking Rowena's every move, sharpening a piece of stolen flint against the floorboards. A week later, twin toddlers were left in a basket on the porch. They couldn't control their shifting at all, popping between human skin and furry paws with every sneeze or hiccup. There were now 6 of them. 6 orphans from the Alpha King's brutal systematic purge of the rogue factions. The border guards had clearly established an unspoken illicit protocol. Kill the rebels, spare the pups, dump them at the healer's cabin, leave a few pathetic coins to appease their own consciences. Rowena's life became a grueling cycle of survival. She woke before dawn. The cabin was always freezing. She would build up the fire, navigating the bodies of 6 sleeping, shifting children, huddled together on the rugs like a litter of stray dogs. She hauled water. She chopped twice as much wood. She stretched her provisions, boiling bones for broth, until they turned to chalk, mixing sawdust into the flour to make the bread heavy enough to fill empty stomachs. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was loud, messy, and violent. "Give it back." The shriek tore through the cabin. Rowena dropped her wooden spoon and turned from the hearth. Clara had Bran pinned to the floorboards. She was half-shifted, her fingernails elongated into claws, pressing into the boy's chest. Bran was snarling his own teeth, lengthening a stolen piece of dried apple clutched in his fist. The twins were wailing in the corner, agitated by the aggression. "Enough!" Rowena's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a whip crack. She walked over, grabbed Clara by the back of her tunic, and hauled the older girl off the boy. Clara twisted, snapping her teeth at Rowena's hand, but Rowena just shifted her grip, holding the girl at arm's length. "He stole my apple." Clara spat, her eyes glowing a dangerous yellow. "I found it!" Bran yelled, scrambling up. "It was on the table, you little thief! Put the claws away, Clara," Rowena commanded. She didn't blink. She stared the feral girl down. It took a long 10 seconds, the air thick with tension, before Clara's shoulders slumped. The claws retracted. Rowena turned to Bran. She held out her hand. "Give it." Bran hesitated. He looked at the dried fruit, then at Rowena's stern, lined face. He placed the apple in her palm. Rowena took out her skinning knife, sliced the apple ring perfectly in half, and handed a piece to each of them. "We do not fight over food in this house. We share. If you fight, you go outside in the snow until you remember how to act like a pack. Do you understand?" They glared at each other, then at the floor. They nodded. Rowena went back to the hearth, her knees aching. She stirred the thin porridge. She was exhausted. A deep, bone-weary fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. She looked at her reflection in the water bucket. She looked 10 years older than she had a month ago. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, her clothes stained with mud and spilled food. Her hands were a map of tiny scars from accidental bites and scratches. She couldn't keep this up. The winter was only just beginning. The meager coin the guards left didn't cover the sheer volume of food growing wolves required. The villagers were already looking at her, with increased suspicion, when she came down to buy bulk oats and salted pork. They knew something was happening up on the ridge. That night, after the children had finally succumbed to sleep, Rowena sat by the dying embers. She pulled out a small wooden box from under her floorboards. Inside was her emergency reserve, 3 gold coins, money she had saved for years. She stared at the gold in the dim light. If she spent it, she had no safety net. If she didn't, the pups would starve by February. She snapped the box shut. Tomorrow she would go to the village. She would buy a side of beef and 2 sacks of flour. She looked over at the tangle of limbs on the floor. Bran had his arm thrown over one of the twins. Clara was sleeping with her back to the door, guarding them, even in rest. They were broken, traumatized, and a massive burden. But they were hers now. Rowena tossed a fresh log onto the fire. Let the Alpha King fight his bloody wars. Let him conquer the continent. She had a war of her own to fight right here in this cabin, and she intended to win it. Part 3. The Shadow at the Door. The blizzard hit 3 days before the solstice. It came down like a white curtain, trapping them inside the cramped cabin. The walls groaned under the wind's assault. The pups were restless, snapping at each other, suffering from cabin fever. Rowena kept them occupied by having them sort dried herbs and mend clothes, but the tension was a physical weight in the room. It was past midnight. The children were finally asleep. Rowena was awake, mending a torn tunic by the light of a single tallow candle. Then the dogs in her care woke up. All 6 of them jolted upright simultaneously. They didn't make a sound. They didn't cry or whine. They sat perfectly rigid, their eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. Clara shifted entirely, a grey wolf, standing defensively in front of the younger ones, the fur on her spine standing straight up. Rowena set her sewing down. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She didn't hear boots. She didn't hear a knock. But she felt it. A heavy, oppressive pressure in the air, thick enough to choke on. The scent of ozone blood and dominant, overwhelming power seeped through the cracks in the doorframe. Someone was standing on her porch. Someone who terrified 6 feral werewolves into absolute, paralyzed silence. Rowena picked up her iron poker. She walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She didn't ask who was there. She unthrown the heavy iron bolt and pulled the door open. The wind howled, driving stinging snow into her face. Standing in the doorway was a man who seemed to block out the storm entirely. He was massive. He stood a head taller than the border guards, his shoulders broad enough to fill the frame. He wore no heavy furs, just dark, hardened leather over a tunic seemingly impervious to the biting cold. A dark cloak whipped violently around his legs. His face was a landscape of harsh angles, shadowed by a dusting of dark scruff. His eyes were a startling, piercing ice blue, glowing faintly in the gloom. He looked down at her. He looked at the iron poker in her hand. A faint, humorless smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "You're going to need a bigger piece of iron healer." His voice was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in Rowena's chest. Rowena didn't step back. She tightened her grip on the poker. "You're letting the cold in. State your business or get off my porch." The man's eyebrows rose fractionally. People didn't speak to him that way. He stepped forward, forcing Rowena to either give ground or be trampled. She took one step back. He crossed the threshold, pushing the door shut behind him with a heavy thud that rattled the hinges. The cabin felt instantly smaller. The air grew stiflingly hot. He surveyed the room. His gaze swept over the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the meager fire, and finally settled on the corner where the children huddled. Clara bared her teeth, a silent, desperate snarl, but she was shaking. "So, the man said softly. The rumors are true. The Witch of the Ridge is running a nursery for traitors. Rowena felt a cold, dread pool in her stomach. She knew who this was. The sheer presence, the absolute dominance radiating from him. It could only be one person. They are children. Rowena said, her voice remarkably steady. She stepped between the man and the huddled pups. And there are no traitors here, only orphans. King Kaelin slowly turned his ice-blue gaze back to her. Up close, he looked exhausted. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and there was a bruised weariness beneath his eyes. He smelled of horse sweat, old blood, and raw, untamed magic. Orphans of my enemies, Kaelin corrected smoothly. Pups of alphas who tried to slit my throat and burn my territories. Do you know what happens to the pups of a dead pack healer? They get dumped at my door by your cowardly guards. Rowena shot back, her temper flaring past her fear. Guards who have more honor than to slaughter infants, but not enough spine to tell their king he's a butcher. Silence stretched tight enough to snap. Kaelin stared at her. His eyes darkened, the blue shifting toward a dangerous, predatory gold. Rowena held her breath. She had gone too far. She was about to die, and the children would be left to the elements. Instead of striking her, Kaelin reached under his cloak. Rowena braced herself. He pulled out a heavy canvas sack and dropped it onto the floorboards with a metallic clink. Then he pulled out a wrapped bundle of cured meats and set it on the table. My guards are not cowards. Kaelin said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. They are following orders. I told them to bring the children here. I told them to leave the coin. Rowena blinked, thrown completely off balance. She looked at the sack on the floor, then back at the king. You sent them. A king cannot show mercy to rebels. Kaelin said coldly, walking toward the fire, forcing Rowena to turn to watch him. He stripped off his leather gloves, holding his large, scarred hands out to the flames. If I bring the children of traitors into my keep, my own bannermen would demand their heads. To spare them publicly is to show weakness. The South would rise again by spring. He looked over his shoulder at her. So I ordered them, brought to the stubborn isolationist healer who hates everyone. I figured you were too contrary to let them die, just because I was the one who sent them. Rowena stared at the broad expanse of his back. The arrogance of the man was staggering. You used me. I utilized an available resource. Kaelin corrected, turning around. He looked at the heavy sack of coin on the floor. And I am paying for the service. That should cover flour and meat for the rest of the winter. And perhaps a larger pot. You are feeding them gruel from the smell of it. They eat what I eat. Rowena snapped, crossing her arms over her chest to hide the fact that her hands were shaking. And you don't get to walk into my home in the middle of the night, insult my cooking, and dictate how I care for them. Kaelin took a step toward her. The air crackled. He stopped inches away, towering over her. Rowena tilted her head back, refusing to look away. I am the Alpha King. He said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. I dictate everything in these lands, not in this cabin, Rowena said quietly. In this cabin, I am the Alpha. You are just a guest tracking snow onto my floor. For a long moment, Kaelin looked like he might rip her throat out. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. Then something shifted in his expression. The gold faded from his eyes, leaving the icy blue. A short, rough sound escaped his chest. It took Rowena a second to realize it was a laugh. You are exactly as maddening as Fen reported. Kaelin muttered, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He looked past her towards the children. Are they well? They are surviving, Rowena said cautiously, stepping aside to give him a better view, though she remained ready to block him if he moved toward them. They have nightmares, they fight, but they are healing. Kaelin watched the huddled mass of pups. The heavy, burdened look returned to his face, making him look older than his years. Keep them alive, Rowena. Keep them hidden. When they are old enough, they will be given a choice to swear loyalty or leave the territory. Until then, They are your pack. He turned back to the door, pulling his cloak tightly around his shoulders. He didn't look at her again as he unbolted the door and stepped back out into the raging blizzard. Buy some decent meat, he called out over the roar of the wind. I might return, and I hate porridge. The door slammed shut. Rowena stood in the center of the room, listening to the wind. She looked at the heavy sack of gold. She looked at the 6 wide-eyed children peeking out from the blankets. The Alpha King hadn't come to kill them. He had come to check on them. Rowena walked over to the sack, untied the coarse rope, and looked inside. More gold than she had ever seen in her life. Enough to rebuild the cabin by cattle hire help. She let out a long, shaky breath and looked at Clara. Well, Rowena said, her voice rough. It seems we are having beef stew tomorrow. The gold was a curse. Rowena realized it the moment she walked into the village market, the heavy satchel weighing down her shoulder. You couldn't just drop a minted royal sovereign on the butcher's counter in Oakhaven without inviting the kind of questions that ended with a rope over a high branch. Poor healers who lived in the crags didn't have gold. They had copper, maybe silver if the harvest was good, and usually just traded pickled cabbage for bacon. So she buried the king's gold beneath the floorboards, right next to her own meager savings. She went to the market with her usual copper and a few silver pieces. She bought 3 sacks of oats, a side of salted beef, and 2 heavy wool blankets. She bore the suspicious glares of the miller and the butcher in silence. You've got a mighty big appetite for a woman living alone on a mountain, the butcher noted, wiping blood on his stained apron as he handed over the wrapped meat. I have a lot of dogs, Rowena said flatly. She hauled the supplies up the mountain on a borrowed sled. The snow was knee-deep now, a thick, suffocating blanket that muted the world. For 3 weeks, the cabin was an exercise in organized chaos. Clara took charge of the twins, her feral hostility cooling into a fierce, snapping protectiveness. Bran chopped kindling, though his hands usually shifted into paws, halfway through the chore ending, with him frustrated and crying in the snow. Rowena cooked cleaned and taught them basic letters using charcoal on a flat piece of slate. They were surviving. But the cabin was shrinking. 6 growing children and a woman in a single room meant there was no privacy, no quiet, and a constant stifling smell of wet fur and damp wool. Then came the 2nd week of January, the coldest night of the year. The scratching at the door wasn't a pup this time. It was a heavy, dull thud, then a wet slide against the wood. Rowena was awake instantly. Clara was already sitting up, a low, rumbling growl vibrating in her chest. Rowena grabbed her knife from the bedside table. She unbolted the door and pulled it inward. A massive weight slumped against her, nearly knocking her to the floor. She braced her legs, dropping the knife to catch the falling body. It was Kalen. He didn't look like a king. He looked like butchered meat. His dark cloak was soaked through stiff with frozen blood. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. The smell of iron and rotting magic hit Rowena's nose sharp and foul. Help me get him inside. Rowena barked at Clara. The girl hesitated, her eyes wide with instinctual terror at the scent of the bleeding alpha. Now, Clara. Clara scrambled forward. Together they hauled Kalen's dead weight across the threshold. Rowena kicked the door shut and bolted it. They dragged him to the rug by the hearth. Kalen was barely conscious. His skin was the color of old parchment. Rowena tore at the clasps of his cloak, throwing the heavy fabric aside. His leather armor was sliced open across his ribs, a deep, jagged gash that wept dark, sluggish blood. The edges of the wound were black webbing outward in ugly, necrotic veins. Silver, and something else. Wolfsbane. A lethal combination meant to kill a shifter slowly, agonizingly, by stopping their cellular regeneration. Get water. Boiling, Rowena ordered. Bran was already moving, his small hands trembling as he hauled the iron kettle over the flames. The twins were awake, whimpering from the corner. Rowena grabbed her healing kit. She dropped to her knees beside the king. He opened his eyes. The ice blue was clouded, hazy with pain. Don't. He rasped, his voice a broken gravel sound. "Don't send word. To the keep. I don't have a raven, Kaelin, and I'm not walking 3 miles in the dark." She muttered, unlacing his armor with quick, unsentimental movements. "Who did this? My own bannerman." A bitter, bloody smile twisted his lips. "The Northern Lords decided I was too soft on the rebel pups." He coughed and blood speckled his chin. "Hold still," Rowena said. She uncorked a small vial of clear liquid. "Pure distilled alcohol. This is going to hurt." She poured it directly into the wound. Kaelin's entire body went rigid. A guttural, inhuman roar tore from his throat. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles popping his fingernails, elongating into thick, dark claws that gouged deep grooves into her floorboards. Clara and Bran shrank back terrified. Rowena didn't flinch. She grabbed a clean cloth and pressed it hard into the open gash, absorbing the poisoned blood. "Bran, give me the tongs. Clara, hold his legs. If he kicks, he'll break my ribs." Clara crept forward, throwing her meager weight over Kaelin's heavy boots. Rowena took the tongs and leaned over the massive, thrashing alpha. "If you bite me," she warned him, her voice low and completely steady, "I will leave the silver shrapnel in your chest and let you rot. Breathe." Kaelin's glazed eyes locked onto hers. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his neck straining like steel cables. He nodded once. Rowena went to work. It took an hour. She dug 3 jagged shards of silver out of his flesh. The metal hissed as it hit the wooden floor, eating away at the finish. She packed the wound with a thick paste of yarrow and garlic, ignoring his stifled groans, and bound his ribs tightly with clean linen. When it was over, she sat back on her heels, wiping sweat and blood from her forehead. Kaelin had passed out entirely. The cabin was dead silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the king's rattling breaths. Rowena looked at the children. They were staring at Kaelin, not with fear anymore, but with a strange, morbid curiosity. They understood blood. They understood survival. She sighed, her bones aching with a profound exhaustion. She pulled a blanket over Kaelin's chest. The Alpha King was sleeping on a rug, and the men who tried to kill him were out there somewhere in the snow. Kaelin woke 2 days later. Rowena was at the table grinding dried willow bark in a stone mortar. The grinding stopped when she heard the slow, deliberate rustle of the blanket. He didn't sit up immediately. He lay there, his icy eyes tracking the ceiling beams, assessing his body. Then he looked at her. "You ruined my floor," Rowena said, not looking up from the mortar. "Those gouges won't sand out. Send the bill to my treasurer." Kaelin grated. His voice was weak, but the commanding timbre was returning. He tried to push himself up on his elbows and immediately clamped a hand over his ribs, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth. "Don't move. You tore muscle and the silver stopped your healing factor. You have to mend like a human for the next week." Kaelin frowned, a look of deep disgust crossing his face. "I don't have a week. You have a choice between staying on that rug or dying in the snow. Pick one." Rowena scooped the ground powder into a cup of hot water and walked over, holding it out to him. "Drink. It helps with the inflammation." He looked at the cup, then at her. He took it, his large fingers brushing hers. His skin was burning hot. He downed the bitter tea without a grimace. A small shuffling sound drew his attention. From beneath Rowena's bed, 2 sets of glowing amber eyes peered out. The twins. Beside the hearth, Bran was sitting cross-legged, whittling a stick, though he was watching Kaelin with wide, unblinking focus. Clara was standing by the door, a heavy iron skillet casually hanging from her left hand. Kaelin slowly swept his gaze over the orphans. He didn't smile. He didn't try to look friendly. He looked at them the way a general looks at raw recruits. "They survived the month?" Kaelin noted. "No thanks to you," Rowena replied, taking the empty cup. "The boy's shifting is uncontrolled." Kaelin observed, nodding toward Bran's hands, which were currently sporting thick pads and dark fur on the knuckles. Bran flushed and hid his hands behind his back. Kaelin shifted his weight, wincing slightly. He fixed his gaze on Bran. "You are fighting the change. That is why it hurts. And that is why it leaks out." Bran swallowed hard. "I don't want to be a wolf. Wolves get killed." The cabin went absolutely still. Rowena watched Kaelin waiting for the anger. He was the king of wolves. To reject the wolf was to reject his entire species. But Kaelin didn't yell. He let his head fall back against the rolled-up cloak Rowena had used as a pillow. "Wolves get killed," he agreed softly. "Men get killed too. But a wolf who knows how to use his teeth has a choice in how he dies. You have no choice right now." He held up his right hand. Right before Bran's eyes, Kaelin's hand shifted. It was fluid, painless, and completely silent. No cracking bones, just a seamless rippling of skin into thick, dark fur and lethal claws. Then just as smoothly it shifted back to a human hand. "Breathe into the belly, not the chest." Kaelin instructed, his voice low and rhythmic. "Don't push the wolf down. Pull it in. It is a tool, like an axe. You don't leave an axe half-swung." Bran stared at Kaelin's hand. Slowly the boy closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, his stomach expanding. When he pulled his hands out from behind his back, the fur was gone. Clara lowered the iron skillet an inch. Over the next 4 days, the dynamic in the cramped cabin shifted entirely. Kaelin was a terrible patient, stubborn, demanding, and constantly trying to walk before the wound was closed. Rowena fought him at every turn, snapping at him when he tried to chop wood, berating him when he refused the willowbark tea. But with the children, Kaelin was entirely different. He didn't coddle them. He demanded absolute silence when he was resting. He made Clara practice her knife-throwing on a stump outside, correcting her stance with sharp, clinical barks. He showed the twins how to track mice under the floorboards using smell alone. He was teaching them how to be what they were, something Rowena, for all her herbal knowledge, could never do. Late on the 5th night, Rowena sat by the fire mending Kaelin's ruined tunic. The children were asleep. Kaelin was sitting in the single armchair, a heavy blanket over his lap, staring into the flames. "They aren't going to be safe here forever," Kaelin said quietly. The silence between them was no longer hostile. It was worn and comfortable. "They're safe until the snow melts." Rowena didn't look up from her needlework. "After that, I don't know. The men who ambushed me were looking for a reason to challenge my claim to the territory. Sparing the southern pups is weakness in their eyes." Kaelin turned his head to look at her. The firelight cast sharp shadows across the rugged planes of his face. "If they find out they are here, they won't just kill the pups. They'll burn this cabin to the ash with you inside it." Rowena tied off a thread and bit the end. She smoothed the heavy leather. "Then I suppose you need to heal quickly so you can go kill them first." A low chuckle vibrated in Kaelin's chest. "You are remarkably pragmatic for a healer. I heal the things that deserve to live. I don't lose sleep over the rest." She stood carrying the mended tunic over to him. She tossed it onto his lap. He caught it. He didn't look at the tunic. He looked at her hands. The calluses, the small scars from Clara's earlier biting phases, the burn marks from the hearth. He reached out and gently caught her wrist. Rowena froze. His grip wasn't tight. It was a question. His thumb lightly traced a faded scar over her vein. His skin was rough, calloused from swords and rains, but the touch was startlingly gentle. "Why did you take them in?" Kaelin asked, his voice a low murmur that seemed to fill the small space between them. "You could have shut the door. You owe me nothing." Rowena looked down at him. At the exhaustion in his eyes, the brutal weight of a crown he clearly despised. "Because I know what it's like to be left in the cold," she said softly. She didn't pull her hand away. "And because someone has to clean up your messes." Kaelin's eyes darkened, the ice melting into something far more dangerous. He pulled her hand closer, his breath ghosting over her knuckles. A sharp snap of wood from outside shattered the moment. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct sound of a heavy boot breaking a frozen branch. Kaelin dropped her hand instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the cold, lethal stillness of the Alpha King. He didn't speak. He pointed to the children, then to the heavy iron bolt on the door. They had been found. There was no time for fear. Rowena moved with absolute efficiency. She practically threw the twins under the heavy oak bed frame, shoving Bran in after them. "Stay quiet. Do not shift." She hissed at Bran. Clara was already standing. She hadn't gone to the bed. She stood beside the hearth, a rusted wood axe clutched in her hands, her eyes glowing a brilliant, terrifying yellow. Kaelin pushed himself up from the chair. He grunted, a hand flying to his bandaged ribs, but he didn't stop. He grabbed his mended tunic, pulling it over his head, and reached for the heavy broadsword leaning against the wall. "Stay behind me." Kaelin ordered Rowena, his voice a flat, dead calm. "It's my cabin." Rowena snapped, grabbing her iron poker and a small clay jar from her herb shelf. "I don't hide." A voice echoed from the darkness outside, carrying over the howl of the wind. "Open the door, witch. We know you have the mongrel pups in there. Hand them over, and we might leave you your head." Kaelin's jaw tightened. "Bale," he muttered. "One of my northern lieutenants." "He tracked you?" Rowena asked. "He tracked the weakness." Kaelin corrected grimly. "He thinks I'm dead or dying. He's here to finish the bloodline of the South so he can claim their land. If we give them to him, he'll slit their throats on your porch," Kaelin said. He stepped in front of the door. "Bar the windows." Before Rowena could move to the shutters, the front door shuddered under a massive impact. Wood splintered around the heavy iron hinges. They were using a battering ram. Crack! The center panel of the door buckled. Cold wind and snow blasted through the splintered gap. Rowena uncorked the clay jar. It was filled with finely ground black pepper dried chili and glass dust, a concoction she kept for the mountain bears. Crack! The iron bolt tore free from the frame. The door burst open. 3 men rushed the threshold. They weren't in wolf form. They were large, brutal-looking men in heavy furs, carrying axes and drawn swords. Rowena threw the jar hard against the stone doorframe. It shattered, sending a massive, choking cloud of red and black dust straight into the faces of the attackers. The first 2 men screamed, dropping their weapons to claw at their burning eyes, their lungs seizing as the chili and glass tore at their mucous membranes. Kaelin didn't hesitate. He stepped into the cloud completely unbothered. His broadsword swung in a brutal economic arc. The sound of steel shearing through bone and leather was loud and wet. The 2 blinded men dropped to the floor dead before they realized they were bleeding. But there were more outside. A massive grey wolf lunged through the doorway, leaping over the bodies. It bypassed Kaelin entirely, aiming straight for Rowena. Before Rowena could swing the poker, a blur of motion intercepted the wolf mid-air. It was Clara. The 12-year-old girl hadn't shifted completely. She had just let the claws and teeth out. She slammed into the adult wolf, driving her thumbs directly into its eyes with a feral, terrifying screech. The wolf thrashed, throwing Clara off, but the damage was done. The beast whimpered, shaking its head. Kaelin brought the pommel of his sword down on the back of the wolf's skull. A sickening crunch echoed in the room, and the beast collapsed. "Clara, get back!" Rowena yelled, hauling the girl up by her tunic and shoving her behind the hearth. From the darkness of the porch, a massive figure stepped into the light of the cabin fire. He was taller than Kaelin, heavily scarred, holding a dripping battle-axe. Bale. He looked at Kaelin, then at the bodies on the floor. A cruel, mocking smile spread across his face. "Look at you, Kaelin." Bale sneered. "Playing nursemaid in the dirt. You're bleeding out. You don't have the strength to shift, and you don't have the breath to fight me." Kaelin stood amidst the carnage of the doorway, his broadsword lowered. His breathing was heavy, the white linen bandaging beneath his tunic already blooming with fresh red blood. The exertion had torn the stitches. "I don't need to shift to kill a coward," Kaelin said softly. Bale roared, lunging forward with blinding speed. The axe swung in a deadly horizontal arc aimed right at Kaelin's neck. Kaelin didn't try to block it. He knew his injured ribs wouldn't hold the impact. Instead, he dropped into a crouch, stepping inside the arc of the weapon. He drove his shoulder directly into Bale's chest. The impact sounded like two boulders colliding. Bale stumbled back, but Kaelin's wound screamed. The king faltered his knee, buckling. Bale recovered instantly. He brought the butt of his axe down onto Kaelin's back, driving the king to the floorboards. "You're done, Kaelin." Bale spat, raising the axe high for the killing blow. Rowena didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds. She just saw the man who had sat by her fire, who had taught an orphaned boy how to breathe about to be butchered. She lunged forward, swinging the heavy iron poker like a baseball bat. The iron connected solidly with the side of Bale's knee. The joint gave way with a wet pop. Bale bellowed in agony, the axe swing going wide and burying itself in the floorboards inches from Kaelin's head. Bale backhanded Rowena a brutal dismissive strike that sent her flying backward. She slammed into the wooden table pane, exploding in her ribs and jaw. She tasted copper. Bale turned his attention back to Kaelin, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. "Stop!" The voice was high-terrified, but completely steady. Bale paused, looking toward the bed. Bran had crawled out. The 6-year-old boy was standing in the center of the room. He wasn't crying. He was breathing deeply, into his belly, not his chest. Bale laughed. "Look at this. The little traitor pup wants to play." Bran's eyes flared a brilliant, unnatural gold. Kaelin, pushing himself up from the floor, saw the boy. "Bran, no." Kaelin barked, but the boy had already let go. It wasn't a half-shift. It was violent, explosive, and entirely uncontrolled. The boy's bones cracked loudly, his body expanding, tearing through his clothes. In 2 seconds, an adolescent, heavily muscled wolf stood where the boy had been. He didn't look like a pup. Fueled by adrenaline and raw terror, the wolf looked feral, desperate, and deadly. Bale stared, momentarily shocked. It was all the time Kaelin needed. The Alpha King didn't grab his sword. He pushed off the floorboards, ignoring the tearing of his own flesh. As he moved, the air in the cabin seemed to superheat. Kaelin shifted mid-lunge. It was a terrifying sight. 1 second a bleeding man, the next a monstrous pitch-black wolf easily twice the size of Bale. The sheer power rolling off Kaelin's form was suffocating. The black wolf didn't bite Bale. He slammed into him like a battering ram, pinning the man to the floor. Kaelin's massive jaws clamped over Bale's entire face and throat. There was a sickening crunch. The lieutenant's body went completely limp. Silence fell over the cabin save for the howling wind rushing through the broken door. The black wolf slowly let go of the dead man. He stood his chest, heaving his dark fur matted with Bale's blood and his own. He turned his massive, terrifying head toward the center of the room. Bran, in his wolf form, was trembling violently, backed into a corner, baring his teeth in sheer panic. He was trapped in the change, terrified of the massive black alpha standing over the corpses. The black wolf took a step forward. Bran snapped his jaws, a warning born of pure fear. Rowena, spitting blood from her mouth, pulled herself up from the floor. She ignored the aching in her ribs. She walked directly between the massive black wolf and the panicked, shifting boy. She put her hand on Kaelin's blood-soaked snout. "Enough," she whispered. The black wolf froze. His ice-blue eyes locked onto hers. The violence in them slowly, agonizingly began to recede. He leaned into her palm, a heavy, exhausted weight before stepping back. The bones popped, the fur receded, and Kaelin fell to his knees in his human form, clutching his bleeding side, his breathing ragged. Rowena turned to the panicked pup in the corner. She didn't yell. She knelt in the blood and wood splinters. "Bran," she said softly. "Breathe into the belly. I've got you." Slowly the golden light faded from the wolf's eyes. The fur receded. Bran collapsed onto the floorboards as a naked, sobbing boy. Rowena caught him, wrapping her arms around his shaking shoulders, pulling him tight against her chest. She looked over the boy's head at Kaelin. The king was sitting on the floor amid the bodies, his eyes locked on her. He wasn't looking at her like a nuisance anymore. He was looking at her like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. The cabin was shattered. The snow was blowing in. They were surrounded by dead men. But they were alive. And for the first time, Rowena realized she wasn't just protecting the pups from the king. She was protecting the king from his own kingdom. The cold was the immediate problem. With the heavy oak door splintered into kindling, the cabin was bleeding heat faster than the hearth could produce it. The blizzard outside hadn't stopped. It was howling through the entryway, whipping snow across the bodies of the dead men. Rowena handed the shivering Bran to Clara. "Take him to the bed. Keep the twins under the blankets. Do not look at the floor." Clara nodded, her face pale, her jaw set tight. She herded the younger ones away from the carnage. Rowena turned back to the room. Caelan was on his feet. He was heavily leaning against the stone of the hearth, a fresh stream of blood soaking through his tunic from his torn stitches. He was staring at Bale's body, his expression unreadable, calculating. "We need to block the door," Rowena said. She didn't wait for his response. She walked over to the heavy wooden dining table. She grabbed the edge and pulled. It barely moved. Caelan walked over. He didn't speak. He grabbed the other end. Together they dragged the heavy oak table across the room and wedged it tightly into the broken door frame. It wasn't perfect. Wind still whistled through the gaps, but it stopped the bulk of the snow. Rowena grabbed 2 heavy wool blankets and nailed them over the remaining space with iron tacks. The immediate freeze was halted. Then came the reality of the dead. 3 men. 2 by the door, Bale in the center. "We can't leave them here," Rowena said, her voice flat. She tasted blood in her mouth. Bale's backhand had loosened a tooth and split her lip open. "They'll rot when the fire warms the room, and the smell will bring the mountain cats." "The ground is frozen." Caelan rasped, his breathing terribly shallow. "You cannot dig a grave. I have no intention of burying men who came to kill children," Rowena replied coldly. She grabbed her heavy winter cloak and threw it over her shoulders. "There is a drop-off 30 yards behind the cabin. The gorge is 200 feet deep. The scavengers can have them." Caelan looked at her. Really looked at her. There was no horror in her eyes, just the grim, exhausting arithmetic of survival. He nodded once. It took them 3 hours. It was brutal, agonizing work. They dragged the bodies one by one out the back window, pulling them through the deep snow. Caelan was useless for the heavy lifting his ribs, screaming with every step, so Rowena did the bulk of the pulling. She wrapped ropes around their ankles, leaning her weight forward like a draft horse, dragging the dead men through the blizzard. Caelan helped push them over the edge. When they finally tumbled Bale's massive frame into the dark abyss, Rowena collapsed into the snow. She lay on her back, staring up at the swirling white sky. Her muscles burned. Her hands were numb. A shadow fell over her face. Caelan stood above her. He reached down with his good arm. Rowena took his hand. He hauled her to her feet, his grip iron tight. They stood there in the snow for a long moment, breathing heavily, the adrenaline fading into a crushing fatigue. "Your lip is bleeding," Caelan noted. His thumb reached out, brushing the corner of her mouth. His touch was jarringly warm against the freezing air. "Your ribs are open." Rowena shot back, though she didn't pull away from his hand. "Let's go back inside before we both freeze to death. I have to scrub the floor." They climbed back through the window. The children were asleep, piled in a desperate knot of limbs on the bed. Rowena fetched her medical kit. She didn't bother with boiling water this time. She sat Caelan down on the stool, stripped off his ruined tunic, and poured the raw alcohol directly into his torn stitches. He gritted his teeth, his hand gripping the edge of the stool so hard the wood cracked, but he made no sound. She sewed him back up. Her hands were steady, methodical. When she finished binding him, she sat back on her heels. Caelan didn't put his tunic back on. He reached forward and gently tilted her chin up. He inspected the dark, ugly bruise blossoming across her jaw from Bale's strike. "He broke a blood vessel," Caelan murmured. He uncorked a small jar of her arnica salve. He scooped a dollop onto his fingers, and began to work it into her skin. His massive, lethal hands were incredibly precise. He traced the line of her jaw, applying just enough pressure to work the medicine in without causing sharp pain. Rowena closed her eyes. The cabin was quiet now, smelling of strong alcohol blood and the sharp scent of pine from the draft. "Why didn't you run?" Kaelin asked softly, his thumb resting against her cheekbone. "When the door broke, you could have gone out the back window. Bale only wanted me and the pups." Rowena opened her eyes. She looked at the scarred, brutally handsome face of the king. "I don't run from my own house," she said stubbornly, "and I don't abandon my pack." Kaelin's eyes darkened. He leaned forward. There was no hesitation, no questioning. He pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, bruised, and tasting of iron and adrenaline. Rowena didn't freeze. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip the bare, heavily muscled planes of his shoulders, mindful of his bandages. It was an anchor in the dark, a silent acknowledgement of the blood they had just spilled to keep breathing. When he finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing was ragged. "You are a terrifying woman, Rowena," he whispered. "Someone has to keep you in line." She replied, her voice trembling, just slightly. The rest of January and all of February passed in a state of claustrophobic siege. They couldn't fix the door until the snow melted enough to fell a new tree, so the heavy table remained wedged in the frame, supplemented by stacked firewood. The cabin was perpetually dim, lit only by the fire and a few tallow candles. Kaelin didn't leave. He couldn't. To return to his keep injured without knowing exactly how deep Bale's treason ran was suicide. He needed to heal. He needed his strength back. So the Alpha King became a houseguest. It was a bizarre domesticity. By the third week, Kaelin's ribs had knit together enough for him to move without grimacing. He took over the heavy labor. He chopped the wood standing on the back porch, in the freezing air, wearing nothing but his trousers, the axe rising and falling in a rhythmic, mechanical cadence. Rowena watched him from the window more often than she cared to admit. The dynamic with the children settled into a rigid, functional order. Kaelin became the absolute authority. If Clara snapped at the twins, a single low growl from Kaelin would send her instantly into a submissive posture. He wasn't cruel. He was just undeniably the alpha. But he also taught them. He spent hours on the rug with Bran, teaching the boy how to trigger the shift voluntarily, how to isolate a single hand or an eye without losing control. He taught Clara how to sharpen a blade properly, ignoring Rowena's sharp protests about giving feral girls sharper knives. "She knows how to use it, Rowena," Kaelin had said, not looking up from the whetstone. "I'm just making sure she doesn't slip and cut her own fingers off." For Rowena, Kaelin became a fixture she didn't know how she had lived without. They didn't speak of the kiss. They didn't need to. It lived in the space between them. It was in the way Kaelin would step behind her while she cooked his chest, brushing her back, resting his chin on her shoulder for just a second to inspect the stew. It was in the way Rowena would silently hand him a cup of hot willow bark tea the moment he sat down from chopping wood, knowing exactly how his back ached. They shared the single bed. The children piled on the rugs by the fire, a massive tangle of blankets and limbs. The first night Kaelin had slid into the narrow mattress beside her, he had been stiff keeping his back to her, trying not to crowd her. Rowena had sighed in the dark, rolled over, and pressed her back against his solid chest, throwing his heavy arm over her waist. "Go to sleep, Kaelin," she had muttered. He had tightened his grip, burying his face in the crook of her neck, and slept for 12 straight hours. By March, the food was running critically low. The king's gold was useless if they couldn't get down the mountain. They were eating thin broth heavily padded with dried roots and pine nuts. Kaelin was losing weight, the heavy muscles of his chest and arms leaning out into sharp, dangerous cords of tension. He spent more time looking out the gaps in the window shutters, staring down the mountain towards the south. "The snow is turning to slush," Kaelin noted one morning, tracing a line of condensation on the glass. "The pass will be open in a week." Rowena stopped sweeping the floor. She leaned on the broom handle. "And then what?" Caelan turned to look at her. He didn't have a crown, but he looked every inch a king in that moment. The exhaustion was gone. The lethal commanding presence had fully returned. "Then I go back to the keep. I find the men who conspired with Bale, and I remove their heads from their shoulders. And the pups." Rowena gestured to the children who were currently wrestling over a piece of carved wood in the corner. Caelan watched them. His jaw tightened. "If I take them to the keep now, it will trigger a civil war. My loyalists will protect them, but the northern lords will demand their blood. It's too volatile." "So you leave them here," Rowena stated. It wasn't a question. "They are safe here, with you." Rowena gripped the broom handle tighter. "I am a healer, Caelan. I can feed them and bandage their knees. I cannot teach them how to survive in your world. Bran is shifting into a full wolf. The twins are growing. In a year, this cabin won't hold them." Caelan crossed the room. He took the broom from her hands and tossed it aside. He took her face in his hands. "I will return for them." Caelan said, his voice a fierce, low vow. "And I will return for you. I just need time to purge my court of the rot." Rowena looked up into his ice-blue eyes. She wanted to believe him, but she knew the world. Kings made promises in the dark that the daylight burned away. "Just don't get yourself killed again," she whispered, stepping out of his grip. "I'm out of clean bandages." The thaw came fast and violent. The mountain streams swelled with freezing water, and the heavy snowpack melted into thick, sucking mud. The day the riders arrived, the cabin door was finally open, letting the crisp spring air wash out the stale scent of winter. Rowena was on the porch, showing Clara how to string a hunting bow. Caelan was down by the woodpile. The sound of hooves squelching in the mud echoed up the ridge. Clara immediately dropped the bow, her eyes flashing yellow, a low growl tearing from her throat. Bran and the twins scrambled out from under the porch, their fur bristling. Caelan didn't run. He stood up straight, resting his hand on the handle of his broadsword. A dozen riders broke through the tree line. They wore the heavy black and silver armor of the Alpha King's elite guard. At the front was a massive man with a scarred scalp, riding a heavy war horse. Gideon, the captain of the King's Guard. Gideon saw Caelan standing by the woodpile. The captain practically threw himself off his horse, dropping to one knee in the mud, bowing his head. The 11 other riders instantly followed suit. "My king." Gideon's voice was rough with emotion. "We searched the northern pass. We found the ambush site. We thought you were dead." Bale thought the same. Caelan said coldly, walking toward his men. He was wrong. Gideon looked up. His eyes tracked past Caelan landing on the porch. He saw Rowena. Then he saw the 4 feral children flanking her. Their teeth bared, their eyes glowing. The captain stiffened his hand instinctively, dropping to the hilt of his sword. "My king, the southern orphans, the rumors were true." Caelan stopped. He turned around, looking at Rowena and the children. Then he looked back at his captain. "Take your hand off your sword, Gideon," Caelan said softly. It was a command that carried the weight of an execution block. Gideon dropped his hand instantly. "They are not southern orphans," Caelan announced, his voice carrying over the clearing. "They are my wards, under my direct protection. Anyone who raises a hand to them, who speaks against them in my court, will answer to my teeth." The guards remained silent, their heads bowed. They knew better than to question the Alpha King. Caelan walked past his men up the steps of the porch. He stopped in front of Rowena. "The pass is open," Caelan said. "I have a kingdom to clean." Rowena crossed her arms over her chest. Her heart was beating frantically against her ribs, but she kept her face perfectly impassive. "Then go clean it. We have planting to do." Caelan didn't smile. He looked at the heavy iron poker resting against the doorframe. He looked at the fresh wood stacked neatly on the porch. "The keep is made of stone," Caelan said quietly for her ears alone. "It is cold, it is massive, and there is no one there who will throw a jar of pepper into an assassin's face for me." Rowena swallowed hard. "I don't belong in a castle, Kaelin. I don't wear silk, and I don't curtsy to lords. I don't want you in silk," he growled, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. "I want you at my back. I want you to look at my court the way you look at a poorly chopped pile of wood, like you want to fix it. Bring the pups. Bring your knives. Come with me." Rowena looked down at the mud. She looked at the 12 heavily armed guards waiting in the clearing. Then she looked at Clara. The feral girl was watching them intently. Clara didn't look terrified anymore. She looked to Kaelin, then to Rowena, waiting for the Alpha to make the call. Rowena sighed. She reached out and grabbed Kaelin's heavy leather tunic, pulling him down slightly so she could look him dead in the eye. "If any of your lords look at these children wrong—" Rowena said, her voice a dangerous hiss. "I won't wait for you to execute them. I will poison their wine myself. Are we clear?" A slow, vicious smile spread across Kaelin's face. It was the smile of a wolf who had finally found his mate. "I expect nothing less, healer." Rowena let go of his tunic. She turned to the children. "Bran, Clara, grab your blankets. Get the twins." Rowena walked past the king, heading into the cabin to gather her medical kit and her hidden stash of gold. "We are going to the city. Apparently the king needs someone to tell him how to run his house." Kaelin stood on the porch, watching her walk inside. He looked back at his stunned captain. "Mount up, Gideon." The Alpha King commanded, a deep resonance of absolute satisfaction in his voice. "The Queen is packing." And so, the outcast healer didn't just save a pack of orphans, she became the terrifying, grounded heart of a kingdom. Rowena and Kaelin didn't build a fairy tale, they built a fortress of loyalty, blood, and survival. Did you love seeing a heroine who fights with cast-iron skillets and pepper instead of magic? If you enjoyed this gritty, grounded werewolf romance, smash that like button, share this video with your pack, and make sure you subscribe and ring the bell for more epic, hard-hitting fantasy stories.